Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the special interview. Today we have a returning guest to the show, Dave Collum. Dave is a chemist. He is a professor of organic chemistry at Cornell University. He is an amateur economist who I would argue is better than 99% of the economists out there, and he is the best troll in all of Twitter. Dave, I'd like to thank you for returning again to Silver Doctors.
The best troll on Twitter. Boy, that is such a loaded term. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I do think that you are, because you're one of the people that we follow on a regular basis. And I tell you, not many tweets make me laugh, but yours make me laugh more than anybody. So it's really great. And I appreciate that, because people are so reserved now to actually say what's on their mind on Twitter, just because everything is so cutthroat and divided, in my opinion, in the country.
Well, I'm 64 years old. I could retire today if I wanted to. I've done well enough to do that, and I've got 5 years of funding for my research program, which gets me to 69. It turns out, and so I'm kind of bulletproof, right?
Nice. That sounds good. Now, Dave. Now, I'm not sure exactly how many words your 2019 year in review was. I'm sure you know what the word count was on that, but it's 2 parts and it's quite lengthy. I know the word count is in the thousands. Now, I searched both parts of your 2019 year in review, and the word Iran comes up one single time. And the one single time Iran comes up, it's not even isolated as a single word. It's Iran-Contra affair. And it was just a reference jumbled in with many references to things that occasionally come out to the public's view. So, that kind of sounds like Iran was a black swan at the end of the year and at the beginning of this year, but now all of a sudden everything's magically better. So what are your thoughts on what is going on with this U.S.-Iran crisis right now, Dave?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I was shocked that we could bomb them and knock out a high-ranking official in such a sort of a brazen way. I voted for Trump, actually, because I thought he would not be militaristic. And you can make the argument that, well, therefore you were just dead wrong, or you can make the argument that this is as good as you can get from a non-militaristic president who's being jerked around by an industrial military state as big as one we have. So I don't quite know what my take on Trump's non-militaristic approach to life is. The people who hate him, of course, think he's just bombing everyone under the sun, but Obama did an amazing job of bombing the hell out of people. I get the feeling there's some, when it first started, I thought, this is going to get bad. I get the feeling that right now the storyline is that it's just Kabuki Theater, and that we bombed a guy who they didn't really care about, because I don't think anyone cares about anyone over in the Middle East. And then they threw some bombs. The rumor out there was that they said, here, we're going to bomb here, get you guys out of the way. And that's why there were no casualties, right? And so they basically, bombed a Potemkin airstrip. And then they could say to their people, look, we fought back against the infidels, and we could say we killed their main guy, sort of like, when Khashoggi got whacked. And that no one actually gives a damn. It's possible it's that simple. The other possibility is that if people do give a damn, then we're not going to see this battle fought as an open war in the normal sense. If I'm the Iranians, I know they're smart enough to figure out how to screw us every imaginable way, right? I've always said, if I wanted to terrorize the United States, this will probably get me thrown in Guantanamo, but if I decided to terrorize the place, I'd fill a van with Molotov cocktails at 3 a.m, drive through Ithaca, New York, and throw them through, front windows. And within 10 minutes, the town of Ithaca would burn to the ground. And that would be so easy to do. And you even in theory could get away. And the only downside of that apparently is that you don't get 72 virgins. And if you get away, although I still am not convinced that the Quran says the virgins have to be humans. So
if it's Kabuki Theater, is there going to be an Act 2 here? Because it seems like the news cycle is pretty much already ready to move on from this.
Yeah, it does feel like it was just kind of a farce to me. It feels, a couple of people died on their side, and no one died on our side, and I just maybe this is non-militaristic Trump, right? Maybe he kills someone once in a while, and in the Middle East, dead bodies are not rare. So it's this is a statistic, right? This is just in the air bars of the Middle East. I've come to the point where I don't believe anything I read, which makes me a bit of a moron at this point. But I literally don't know how to. Some guy gave me hell. Scott Nations of CNBC gave me hell one day for posting what he said was an article I could debunk in 2 minutes. And I went to factcheck.org where he said they debunked it. And within 2 minutes, I'd debunked factcheck.org. And Snopes and those guys, they're all frauds. And so how do you debunk anything in this world? I just don't know.
Yeah, I actually would agree with that, and I take everything with a grain of salt and assume that I'm being lied to first and foremost.
Right.
Shifting gears here.
Raising teenagers, by the way. If you have teenagers, same rule.
Yes. Well, they play the mom and the dad side with me, so they do the go to him first, then go to her second.
Right.
Shifting gears a little bit here, Dave, I want to read a tweet you sent out on April 21st, 2019. And I'm going to read the whole tweet, and it says, "You morons with your econ PhDs are going to destroy the system. There's going to be an armed insurrection when you are hanging upside down like Mussolini. You can ponder why negative interest rates in cashless society were a bad idea." Now, people are going to think that's hyperbole, but you see, I don't think that that's hyperbole at all. And I find it interesting because one of the justifications that Trump gave with the strike against Soleimani was that he was indirectly killing millions of people. And I would argue, is the Fed not indirectly killing millions of people by their monetary policy when, for example, elderly are forced to pick their poison between paying for medicine or heating their home in the winter or buying food, right? Do you want to die slowly or do you want to die more quickly by not having your meds that you can't afford anymore? So I don't think that tweet was hyperbole at all. And I think that sometime down the future, that is what's coming. So did you have any thoughts that you could add on to that, Dave?
Well, I can't see it in front of me. You might have it in front of you. I don't know. If you look at probably timestamps later at night, and it's not because I'm drinking or anything like that, but I think at night I maybe get a little tired and a little less filtered, and so I'm more likely to put out a tweet like that. Everything I keep coming to, the evils of the world, I keep swinging back to the Fed. And I know that macroeconomists who adore the Fed think therefore I'm just a grumpy guy, but things like wealth inequality are the Fed, and the Fed is trying to, the famous Overton window, the idea that there's this window of things that are considered reasonable or possible. That's the Overton window, and if you can open that means you have more options, more possibilities. The Fed's opened the Overton window, so now they've got sane people talking about insane topics like they were not insane topics. And so they talk about negative interest rates, right? Negative interest rates are for idiots, right? Anyone who talks about a negative interest rate in a positive term, I'm declaring you're a moron, right? I'm just willing to say you're stupid, you're gullible, you're ignorant, you're something. But if you get a PhD in economics, I think you're an idiot. And maybe you have some sort of SAT quality intellect, but these same smart people wouldn't have waxed philosophically in some sort of forgiving way 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? They would have said, no, that's insane. The free market would never let you have a negative rate. It's taking the square root of -1, right? It's just stupid. But now they've opened that window, and now you've got the Fed waxing philosophically about buying other assets. And so the macroeconomists who all sign off on this, they've just lost their minds because the Overton window is now so wide open that they're willing to entertain ideas that would get you medicated in any other era in history, except those eras where it worked horribly, like, in Weimar Germany and 18th century France and all the places where these things failed.
Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. Because I would actually, argue that you could, in fact, argue that the Fed could be considered a terrorist organization just based on what they have done. And the thing that frustrates, here's what frustrates me about it, Dave, because, the last 5 videos, the last 5 live streams that we've put out have all been demonetized by YouTube. And we talk about nothing conspiratorial. We're just a couple guys giving our, analysis on the state of the economy and the markets. But everybody who gets to talk about the Fed, right, that do get a voice, it's all the enablers and the apologists and the armchair quarterbacks and all they should raise a little bit here, or well, the economy needs it. And then that's the other thing is that, well, the Fed had to do it to keep the markets up. But you see, I don't think that delaying this pain, because you can't stop the business cycle, right? I mean, we have to have a recession. You can't breathe out forever without breathing in. So am I off on my thinking there, Randall, Dave?
No. The Fed has lost institutional foundations, in my opinion. So they've lost the most, first and foremost, they've lost their institutional fear of inflation. So now, when the Fed says we're worried about inflation, they're worried about it not being high enough, right? So that's a kind of a moron level thinking that that only a macroeconomist could come up with. The Fed has lost all institutional sense of free markets. So they do not believe free markets should be allowed to set prices of any asset, whether it's the bond market or whether it's just more generically the cost of capital or whether it's the equity market, right? Or the real estate market. They now think they're in charge of climate change. So I would say as an institution, they've gone full retard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Interesting with that. Thank you for that. So I'd just like to get your, because it surprises me that there's still an inflation deflation debate going on. But I'd just like to get your assessment.
I think that's real though, because I think so we have inflation, but I think the risk of the corrective measure to that is a massive deflation. So I think that debate should stay alive. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right? But it's not a debate about what we have right now.
Okay. So I'd like to get your assessment of the economy. Do we have a booming economy? And then just as a side note, how can you make America great again before you drain the swamp? So just first of all, what's your assessment of the economy right now? And where is the economy headed in 2020?
Oh, boy, that's like, what's the origin of hunger and poverty? The economy, to me, first and foremost, you have the problem where we have the lowest unemployment rate in history while 100 million working age adults are not working. So you have that paradox so you've got these terrible statistics. You've got terrible statistics on inflation. So I think if we use real inflation numbers, if your readers have not seen this, I urge you to Google it. There's a thing called the Chapwood Index, one word, Chapwood. It's kind of a shadow stats-like index. And that thing shows in the 50 major cities over the last 5 years that inflation's been running hot as hell, like 10%. Now, that even to me seems too high. But they take 500 items and monitor the price in 50 cities, right? This is not hard to picture, and how they do it. And I have a former grad student who's now working at Genentech in San Francisco, and he lives in the ghetto. He lives in a neighborhood where you have to step over feces, you have to step over homeless people to get to work. He's paying $4,000 a month for his apartment, and so that's pretty inflationary, right? And so I think the economy numerically is being measured wrong, right? So if, for example, inflation is measured wrong, if the economy has been rolling along over the last decade at an estimated about 2.2%, it's already stagnating pretty badly. This is a terrible growth rate over a decade that's supposed to have boomed. If inflation is being mismeasured, which is directly goes into the GDP calculation, if it's being mismeasured by 2%, then the economy hasn't been growing for 10 years. And so if you doubt inflation, you doubt the GDP. And if you doubt the GDP, you doubt the economy. Now, that's not to say that people aren't working, but what are they doing, right? Having tons of baristas and having tons of coffee shops and having tons of people working multiple jobs. By the way, I don't know, actually, do they double count if you work 2 jobs? Does that count as 2 jobs being managed? And as a consequence, do they say, okay, there's X million jobs filled? So could we actually have a much bigger unemployment rate because everyone else is working twice as many jobs? I don't know, actually. If someone knows this, send me an email. So I don't think the economy is doing particularly well. If I sort of stand back, wide angle lens and say, okay, let's look at what happened from my childhood to the present, Um, my childhood, the monster companies that were moving everything forward were Alcoa, General Electric, U.S. Steel, Exxon Mobil sort of companies, and they were juggernauts. In fact, my son gave me issues of Time and Life magazine from the date I was born. It was a very clever Christmas gift. And when you go through Time magazine, all the ads were smokestack companies, humongously powerful companies advertising their product. And now what do we have? We have Twitter, Netflix, Facebook, Google, Tesla, right? These are not wealth creating companies. They create wealth around the edges, but they don't house people, they don't feed people, they don't, and you say, but we're in a digital economy. If you shut down Facebook, wouldn't we all be more productive? Right? If you shut down Twitter, I know there'd be a lot of people actually going back to work and stuff like that. And so these all look like luxury items to me. These look like consumables. Like it's like, what does Disney World do for the economy, right? And it consumes resources. It's not about producing it. It's what you get to go to Disney World after you've produced wealth, right? You don't get to go to Disney World to produce wealth. And so I think that our economy is a bit of a shadow. And that now, meanwhile, what is our debt growing at 5% above GDP? And so it means that we're really not producing what we're not replacing with production what we're consuming. And so, how do you turn that into a generalized statement about the economy? I don't know, but it doesn't feel right to me. How's that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. I appreciate the insight. And it's interesting you're talking about methodology, because one of the questions that I had is everybody's talking about how 2019 was the stellar year for online sales. And because they're talking about the decline in retail brick and mortar black sales over the holiday season, but there was such a substantial increase in online sales. But 2019, if we look at the year, that's the year that eBay started their sales tax policy. So I'm wondering, are they just counting all sales, including sales tax? Because if that is the case, then the sales online were not booming. It's just reflecting the collection of taxes.
It's a revenue stream. It's a change in the revenues, gross revenues, right? The other interesting thing I saw, there's a guy on Twitter called Sheeple Analytics. If you're a Twitter fan, you got to find Sheeple Analytics. This guy, it's a name for the internet. He's a genius, in my opinion. He's a analytical genius. And he posts stuff, and I go, where'd you get that from? How'd you find that? But the other day he posted something simple anyone could have gotten to, but it was some production numbers. I can't remember exactly. He posted two different things that were in sort of the same genus species zone. And what it showed was that when these numbers drop, you're in a recession. And it showed that in 2015-16, by this, and this came from the St. Louis Fed, we were in a recession 2015-16, but no one reported it. So it was the recession that no one reported. And I actually think that's the Fed's model, that if they can somehow bridge recessions without corrective measures, then somehow they can therefore mitigate the pain. But they don't understand that when you have a recession, it's about corrective measures, right? And it's not just about correcting production and stuff like that, but it's also about correcting prices and correcting all sorts of metrics having to do with the economy. So I actually think that they're faking us past some downturns that we don't, and they're just not telling us, actually.
Mm-hmm. I find that very interesting. Shifting a little bit here, you talked a lot about like identity politics, and I guess we could also call that maybe gender politics. One thing that drives me crazy is I don't understand why the wage gap between men and women is such a big thing, because I look at it very simply, right? In the United States Army, right, you've got two sergeants, a male and a female, and they get paid the exact same. Let's say they're an E5, just straight old buck sergeant, right? And they get paid the same exact dollars every single month. Now, the man has to do more push-ups and he has to run faster. So to me, that says that by official government policy, the man is required to do more work for the same amount of pay than the woman. So by official government policy, it appears to me that the woman is actually getting paid the same for less work. if that even made sense. Or talk to me a little about some of the things that you're looking at in gender politics, and whether you think gender politics, identity politics, and all this social justice thing is going to be a big issue again now that we're in an election year.
Oh my God, you keep pulling onions out on me and ask me to mow through the layers. A lot of what you read are isolated instances of things where, like if you read about what's going on campuses, right, and you find out that some wackadoodle said something, or there's a course in some stupid subject that costs at times up to $2,000 a credit, so there's a waste of money for you. But there's 5,000 plus campuses, and so statistically there has to be some insanity out there just on this purely statistical argument. So I think some of it has to do with what's catching headlines. The wage gap thing's a fascinating thing. They've studied this in so many different ways, one of which is, for example, if you look at careers women choose, in academia even, and I don't know if they consciously do this or instinctively do this or what, but supposedly, and I say supposedly because I got it off the internet, right? Supposedly women choose academic pursuits for which the change is not as dramatic. And it's not to say it's not important, it's not to say it's not intellectually profound, but if you're studying medieval history, and if all of a sudden you go off radar for a couple of years because you're busy raising a couple of kids, you can jump back in the game because the Middle Ages hasn't changed. Some new knowledge has come up, but you can catch up, you can keep up, and you can be a scholar and you can compete. If you are in computer science, you're a goner, right? You're already toast. You don't even know where to start almost, right? And so there are fields that you have to race along. And I think women instinctively say, look, my day could be disrupted. And maybe they're choosing that. Now, interestingly, if you look at dental hygienists, I talked to one, and they're all women, right? And the reason they work part-time, supposedly a lot. They're not all doing 8 hours a day. And part of it is because they swap shifts. They pick up their kids from the bus. It's a great career for someone who's juggling that. And so women are naturally picking careers that are pragmatic because they know they got to raise the kids. Men are less pragmatic because they're praying like hell their wife will raise their kids. By the way, for the record, those who've already sort of gotten mad at me, I raised my kids. My wife has chronic health problems. I did all the domestic duties. I had to take her to doctor's appointments. I had to do everything. And so if you want to try to come at me, come at me. I'll take every piece of you. I'll take you down to the studs by the time I'm done because I did it all. But the gender wage gap stats apparently don't account for a lot of this. Now, I'm positive if you looked at a college campus, you looked at the wages of assistant professors, I'm positive the women are ahead of the men. And it's because we're very careful to make sure they are. Google did something where they said, we're going to equalize pay amongst men and women. And they then did the numbers about they had to top off the men. So I think society has made the correction. But if you don't account for all these other things, and choice of job and choice of path and things like that, then you can find all sorts of inequities. I'm sure there's some out there. Women also don't ask for raises and men do, things like that, right? And the meek do not inherit the earth. And so women are compromisers, right? When you evolve in a system where the person you're with can beat the crap out of you at will, you've got to use wily senses to circumvent problems. You don't do it through brute force. And so I think there's always going to be a gender difference, and that might translate to a gender pay gap. Men will forfeit anything to get ahead at times. Very few women want to do that. I agree with the women on that one, right? I don't think forfeiting everything it makes sense, but the crazy, steroid-infested men tend to. So I think that's a polarized topic. There's the soccer players who insist that they should be paid equally to the men, and they won the World Cup, and so blah, 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 right? What they don't mention is that the revenues for women's soccer and World Cup soccer versus men's is a factor of 100. And so to the extent that using a free market model, the women should be paid 100th what the men are paid, right? And they say, we have more viewership. I go, yeah, well, when your men's soccer team gets knocked out, and it's the hometown team and you've got the women, of course you got more viewership, right? but it's not a big revenue sport, right? I went and watched women hockey at Cornell march their way to a sort of a triple overtime in the national title game. The arena was not full, right? And it was very good hockey, and the arena was not full. And that just shows you that there's a demand curve that's totally different. I'm glad the women are doing it. Now they're going to start sticking men in women's sports because they've gone out of their minds, and they'll ruin the female sports. They'll completely destroy women's sports, in my opinion. But I could get in trouble for that. Come at me again. I'm ready for you. I'm defending women's sports. You really want to not defend women's sports? Have a ball.
Now, Dave, just sticking on the identity politics, well, just the school in general. I'll not throw an onion at you this time, but is America being dumbed down, Dave? And how do you see the quality of education of the average person that's entering college? And is college even worth it anymore? I hope that's not an onion.
Well, it's always an onion, right? There's no topic that's as simple as it appears to be on the surface, right? I've studied some of the simplest things in chemistry that turn out to be a mess. That's usually the case. There are certainly problems, and there are problems that come from a lot of directions. So college campuses have gone way left. The activists who tend to be the people who have more time to activate and less time to do scholarship, in my opinion. And if you're a full-time activist and you're offended by that, you're a douchebag. What can I say? The people trying to get something done here are too busy to be activists, right? And they're too busy to try to change, everything under the sun. So the left on campuses are trying to push political correctness down the throats of students who are less demanding of political correctness than the faculty seem to be interested in presenting it. The students we're getting are damaged. Even at Cornell, you can see it, but these are kids. And the evolutionary psychologists have been obsessing over this. Guys like Jonathan Haidt and a bunch of characters are trying to figure out what happened. And I think, in a nutshell, I think there's some critical point in a kid's life where in the past they were doing sports and going outside and breaking bones and things like that. Now they're being totally monitored by parents at all times. They're on Facebook all the time. They're looking at their phones all the time. They can actually measure the peripheral vision of kids, and it's shrinking because of the way their brain is focusing on a screen more. They've done studies where they give a kid a brain teaser, and they measure how long the kid persists before they say screw it. And that number shrinking dramatically, and so they don't persist. My colleagues have noticed, one of my colleagues said the other day that when the kid will come in saying, I don't know why I got this question wrong in a test, what the kid will do is instead of starting, he'll say, well, look at the question. The kid will go right to the bottom of the question and look at what's asked. We all do that, right? I get an email with 3 paragraphs. I'm gonna try to find the punchline and skip the rest because someone's babbling. But when we give them a question in chemistry, the setup is in that whole paragraph, and the kids are going right to what do they want out of me, and therefore they're missing the setup, and so they're bombing questions. The kids aren't taking notes. They have this belief that they can find it on Google. Why do they need to know it? And the answer is, well, because you need an operating system. You need to be able to think. You need to be able to roll ideas around in your head. You can't do that if you have to Google every concept. Now, if you use Google to augment your thinking, that's phenomenal, right? Twitter's phenomenal for augmenting your thinking, but you got to still learn stuff and know stuff and be able to ponder things. Okay. And we don't, in freshman chem, the kids not taking notes is extraordinary, right? Years ago, they studied, kids who take notes and don't take notes. The physical act of taking notes is a very, very important to learning material.
Yes, and thank you for all that, because in my opinion, I would say that, when I was going through school, I've been through school a couple times, and the first time was in the 90s, early 2000s, University of North Carolina. I went through school again after the Army to study computer science. And, just my general feeling is back in the early 90s, I could kind of see a change, but my thought was, school is all about, here's what we know, tell us why we're wrong and tell us what is supposed to be right. That's what I thought school was. It was about teaching things and now go tell us that we're either right or we're wrong about this. But now it seems like school is like rote memorization and submission and obedience to authority. Am I off base in that thinking there?
I would go the other way, right? I'd say you're off base. I wish they'd submit to authority, because then I'd tell them what to do. I think if you looked at the sciences, you'd find nowhere near the corruption. And so I think if you look at the chemistry, we're still beating them like rented mules. We're still making them. There's courses I look at and I go, that's simply being made to be too hard. I can look at a course and say, I think you're just being too rough on the kids. And I'm not a wimp, I don't think, and I think the beatings are constructive, but not to the point of demoralizing them. So I think if you looked at the typical kid coming out of, say, a chem major at Cornell, you'd see a kid who got beat pretty mercilessly at times, and they're ready for the world. They go off to medical school or something, and the word that usually comes back is, "My God, this is easy by comparison."
That's good. That's refreshing. That's good to hear. I appreciate that. Switching gears a little bit because I know that you like gold. Just a little side note as far as the manipulation. I'm not sure where you stand on this, but I have a little theory of mine to why people still in 2020 deny that there's you can read on the Exchange Stabilization Fund's little website at the Department of Treasury at treasury.gov, where it talks about basically we can intervene in any market at any time for any reason, including gold and foreign currencies. So my little theory is that the people who say that there's no active price suppression and active market manipulation are people who just don't feel right about themselves trading in the markets that they know are rigged markets. It's kind of like they can't live with themselves for that. But just generally speaking, what are your thoughts on the markets? You already said the Fed is manipulating it, but do you think they pay extra attention to gold and silver per se? And what is just your thoughts on gold and your outlook on gold there, Dave?
Well, the manipulation has to do with time scales and who. So I don't have any doubt that the big banks that do their prop trading, they manipulate everything, right? They'll run the stops, they'll drive it down, cover their shorts. They're just having their way with us constantly. So if you are an amateur trader, I think you're either unbelievably good, unbelievably lucky, or unbelievably headed for trouble. And so I at that level, I know there's manipulation. Do the sovereign states care about the price of gold? I don't know. At one point, they certainly did. All those memos from Volcker and stuff that have surfaced over the years saying we should have controlled the price of gold. That was when they were trying to control inflation expectations and get them down. Now, here's my question that I would ask you maybe is if the Fed really wants to inflate away something. By the way, the whole idea of inflating away debt is paradoxical unless you just purely monetize it. Because to inflate away debt, to create real inflation the old-fashioned way, you have to create new debt. So there's this odd, how do you inflate away debt by creating debt, right? But if you want to monetize it purely and just say we're just going to print money like the MMT guys say, then yeah, sure, you can inflate it away. And you can also go the way of the Weimar Republic too.
Well, yeah. Yes, well, I would say that's how you inflate it away because it has to be new debt to pay off the old debt. But that's the point, is that it gets to a point where it's that loss of confidence, and then therefore you come up with that new currency, and the debt is in fact inflated away at that point.
Well, in some sense, monetization, if they really monetize, is not new debt to the extent that the Fed in principle could let its balance sheet go to any level, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't see where they can't monetize the debt. And I don't see where they really have to create new debt. In theory, it's a debt, but it's a debt that never has to be called in. So I think they can do that. If you try to inflate away through the banking system in a sort of the banking system proper, they have to create debt to create new money, to create inflation at some level. If the Fed really wanted to cause inflation, right, to cause inflation expectations to rise, to achieve some goal, which I'm doubtful they really understand. I doubt they understand what they're hoping for. Then why would they not actually like the price of gold to run? Right? And if I were in charge of saying, look, let's get some inflation going, why would you step on that scale? right? I'd let that one run. I'd let people say, holy shit, gold's now at 2,200. There must be inflation.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good, interesting point that you make there. Because yes, and ultimately I'm believing that, there would be a reset at the end of all of this, a currency reset, probably on a Sunday evening. Do you see a reset in the future, or how do you see that playing out as far as the debt crisis ultimately being resolved?
Well, there's always resets, right? Anyone who says there's not going to be a reset knows no history. Supposedly there's something like, I don't know, 5,000 currencies known, right? More currencies than genders. And how many currencies exist now, right? 100, maybe. Probably not even that, because a lot of countries are using the dollar and whatever. But let's call it 100 currencies for laughs. Really no more than number of countries, unless you want to throw the bitcoins in there. And so out of 5,000 currencies, 4,900 of them died. So if you don't think this next 100 is going to, if you think that's going to last forever, because we're just so intelligent now, right? I mean, people have been intelligent since 200,000 years ago. So yeah, we'll reset everything. Things like global wars reset. When people were sitting on rubble that used to be their house in Europe, and they couldn't figure out what they were going to eat next, and they couldn't figure out what was going to happen to them, and they were trying to just survive. They were not thinking about who owed the money. And it turns out that at the end of World War II, something like 50% of all the debt in Europe got erased, right? Just got erased. And so you say, well, did you start the war to erase the debt? No, but that's what happens, right? That's a reset. And it doesn't have to be planned or preordained or anything. It's just, it'll keep resetting.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dave, you didn't really talk about this in your 2019, but just from a scientist point of view, I might want to ask this question, because one of the things I'm looking at a lot right now is I think that there's going to be a lot of food price inflation in 2020. And the reason why I say that is because, looking at all of the developments from last year, we had the historic flooding in the Midwest over the spring and summer, including 1 million calves that were lost in Nebraska. We had the Arctic blasts over harvest season, and this is the United States. In Asia, we've had this swine flu, and I saw reports where there was an estimated 25% of the global pork supply has been slaughtered. Now we're seeing outbreaks of bird flu, avian flu in Europe. We're seeing trouble. They were going to have a record harvest last year with rice in India, but then they had some bad weather, and then they had some locust skirmishes. So I'm just looking around, and I'm seeing just these signs, of just that could say, there could be some food supply issues possibly in 2020, and if not food supply issues, at least food inflation, based on just some of those things that I've thrown out to you. Is food inflation a concern for you, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I've thought about exactly that. The world in theory, right? And let me again digress ever so briefly. Every day, probably 2 million people eat lunch in New York City, and no one orchestrates that, right? The restaurants buy what they think they need, and somehow this magical dance occurs where at the end of the day, 2 million people have been fed. There was no Department of Dining in New York. There was no anything. It's just the free market constantly adjusting. I presume the food production of the world fits the same description. So I think it's fairly ridiculous to think that the world intentionally produces 25% excess every year. And so I think there's got to be a feast or famine cycle, right? Where you produce less food one year, and in a year where you've got the alignment of the planets, where all these things have gone wrong, you got to figure that the production is low. Now, there could be a backlog, right? There could be warehouses of soybeans and stuff like that. And the food price inflation could send us into the hedonically adjusted world of saying, okay, if pork is too expensive, then eat chicken, right? And the inflationistas will say, therefore, there's no inflation. They would be wrong. They would be lying or idiots. I hate to sound like some of these concepts seem so straightforward to me that either I'm an idiot or they're an idiot. I don't see a way around it, and I'm not willing to accept idiot status, so I'm calling them idiots. And so I think that it could shift what we eat. right? So it could actually achieve what the vegans of the world want, and that is get us to eat more of the basics and less of the sort of the higher up the food pyramid foods, because pork, 25% of pork, that's a ton of protein that we're not going to get to eat. But if it means therefore we eat the food that normally would be fed to the cows, then what will happen is market arbitrage will kick in and people say, hey, I can get rich growing pork and raising pigs. And so presumably that food inflation will be transitory, because then we'll produce a ton because it's a good business now. So I think it'll just correct back. So I think it might be a fleeting inflation, but I don't think it's a sustainable one.
Okay. Now, and then thoughts on the trade war here, Dave. It sounds like we're going to get a phase 1 signing. Those are the reports coming out this morning, Thursday, January 9th, that delegations coming next week, and they're going to sign phase 1 of the trade deal, even though the details haven't been disclosed, and even though they're still negotiating it. What's going on with the trade war, and what are your thoughts on the trade war?
Well, every Friday we get that same announcement, right? I mean, we get an announcement every week that we're making progress. My original response to the trade war was that if it's Trump doing Trump-like tactics against the Chinese, I think the setup is, and I know a lot of smart macro guys who are not macroeconomists but market guys, who think that the deals with China were terrible. Right. And I have no trouble imagining the mechanism. We set up a bunch of agreements with China when they were basically a billion people, third world country. We're trying to help them pull out of the dark ages. And so we set up all these favorable trade deals, which now have not been torn down. And now they're a superpower in their own way. And they're still trading under these old rules. And so Trump is the guy who came along and recognized that we had to undo some of these deals. Now, Trump haters, they hate anything favorable about Trump. But I know Trump haters who say, yes, but that's true, right? And so if it's a short-lived thing where Trump can somehow put the thumb screws on the Chinese to back them off, and by the way, no other president was going to do it, so you can hate Trump all you want, but he's fighting fights that other presidents were too cowardly to fight, then we in principle win. As I wrote about 2 years ago, I think, but if it becomes protracted, then we lose, right? So he needed to basically, for all intents and purposes, bluff them, right? But if we get into a trade war and we look up and we're still, we pay for the added costs, right? So this, by the way, will be inflationary. So that's my thought. I have long since stopped paying attention to news releases about trade deals.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They come
except for when it's during market hours and the Dow's down 200 points.
Well, I'm not a trader either. And if I was, I would have gone insane, because when the Iranians bombed us the other night, the Dow futures were down 360 and gold was up 30. By the time I got up in the morning, the futures were green and gold was red. And I noticed today that gold got the crap kicked out of it. And so on those time scales, my brain can't function. I can't buy 10-year treasuries that return 1-point-something% hoping that they'll return even lower percentage and I'll be able to sell them, because I'm not a trader. So Joe Sixpack has one choice: to buy and hold stuff that's way overpriced, or to not participate, because they can't trade. Joe Sixpack can't trade, right? I can't jump in and out of the treasury market. It's a guaranteed fatality for me if I jump in and out of the treasury market. And so I can either buy treasuries that will return what is the 10-year right now? 1.6 or something?
Yeah, it was like 1.8. Let me see here.
But it's tiny, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It is. I'm looking right now. It's 1.89. 1.88.
Right. So I pose questions on Twitter. What's the 30-year at? What's the 30-year at?
Oh, I don't have that one up on my screen right now.
I bet I have it. The 10. I bet it's around 3%. Just a guess. How much, if I were to offer you or your viewers the right to buy a fixed income fixed income investment, and it was guaranteed to pay, right? Which is essentially what a treasury is. And you couldn't hedge it, you couldn't sell it. You just had to buy it like you were buying an annuity or something. What percent return would you demand, not knowing the future, not knowing inflation going forward? What would you demand percent-wise for a 30-year investment? Right? Yes. You're young enough where it's like buying a retirement annuity or something, right? What would you demand? And I guarantee you the number's not 3%.
Right. And I don't buy a single treasury because I think that inflation has been severely understated. So that I think that, nominally it might be 3%, but in real terms over 30 years, you're probably going to be losing out there, actually.
Well, 3% is roughly the rate of inflation. It's the Fed would say it's above inflation. I would say it's below inflation, but it's roughly inflation. You are going to retire on dog food if your investments are basically 3% return investments, guaranteed. And inflation in the next 30 years, I've only run into one person who says, look, I think a 3% investment 30 years from now will look smart. I've only run into one guy, prominent bond guy at Citigroup. I had a long conversation with. He said, I think we're going to, it's basically a deflationary model for him. He's not talking about trading them. But at some point, the bond market became completely disconnected from the idea that you're buying a revenue stream. When did this happen? Why did this happen? I don't have great answers, but I, again, always go back to the Fed. They have totally screwed up the bond market so badly. And if you want to see what really screwed up, just look at the Japanese bond market. It's gone. The Japanese bond market no longer exists. It's gone. It is just Japanese putting out debt that the Bank of Japan controls. That's it. So you want to destroy your bond market, your credit market, the core of capitalism. Have a ball. But if you think you're the good guys doing this, you get that moron label yet again out of Dave.
Now, Dave, we've gone for over 45 minutes here, and I appreciate your time because I know I initially told you 30 minutes. I wanted to get your thoughts on silver, because to me, I haven't run the numbers. I haven't run the numbers lately, but to me, this is amazing because there are 4 precious metals: gold, silver, platinum, and palladium. And I used to run the numbers, and I would have to do it again because I'm sure the numbers have gone up. But if you average all 4 of those, it used to be like the average price for 1 ounce of precious metal was $1,250. And with palladium recently hitting above 2,000, I'm sure, and with gold surging again, I'm sure that number is even higher now. And with platinum near 1,000 now. So if you average all 4 precious metals, you get an average price for precious metal of probably, I would say, $1,400. If you take out silver and just average gold, platinum, and palladium, you come up with an average price of, substantially. No, if you just average the 3, the average is probably around $1,400. If you add in silver and average all 4, the average is still around $1,000, yet silver's sitting here at $18 in 2020. So what are your thoughts on silver? I do know in your interview you said that, silver bugs are the craziest people of all people on earth. I think you were stealing that quote.
Wiesenthal said that.
Yeah. So well, that's commonly said.
Joe Wiesenthal said that silver bugs were the most demented people on the earth. And then I used that quote, and Joe said, I'm honored to have been showcased in Dave's year in review. And I'm thinking that's pretty good. I can't tell if he's just being facetious or provocative or whatever. I spent enormous amounts of time pondering silver years ago, watching everything Dave Morgan put out and all these guys. And I've largely stopped thinking about it to the extent that I own it. I'm committed to it. As I understand the silver market, and this is such a neophyte view, it's so dependent on things like when you're mining the other metals that are similar to it. So if the economy's booming and you're mining other metals, presumably you're also pulling a lot of silver out of those streams. And so in some sense, a booming economy produces a supply problem for the silver bugs. And so then, in theory, an economy that turns down, all of a sudden the silver supply should slow down. And then there's the question, people like to talk about the gold-silver ratio. To me, that's a trading thing. If the gold-silver ratio in the crust mattered, then what I would think is because the ratio doesn't change, yet silver gets consumed and gold doesn't, then the gold silver ratio should go from 16 to 1 to some even smaller ratio. So silver ought to be priced higher and higher relative to gold because silver gets consumed. And so, I see various quotes about how much silver is above ground, and I've seen numbers at, 15 billion. Do you have a number at the top of your head that you cite?
Off the top of my head, no. I've heard 6 billion. I've heard 8 billion. I've heard 2 billion. The way that I think about it is if every person on Earth wanted announced, they couldn't have it. So I know, so what I understand is that it's smaller than 8 billion.
Right. So if I could talk my buddy Mr. Einhorn into cornering the silver market, he could single-handedly drive it crazy. And I think silver as a proxy for gold on steroids is not a bad model. I do worry that we're not even close to having any trouble getting it out of the ground, so that if we need more silver, we'll get more silver. I'm not qualified to know that. There was supposedly about a 15-year period where the consumption of silver was far greater than the production of it, and that had my juices flowing all the way up to $49 an ounce. I, by the way, bought most of my silver at about $3.80 an ounce. So silver can do all it wants, and I'm just looking, going, yeah, I don't care. Maybe 50 years from now, if it's still 18 bucks an ounce or something, I'll care. But right now, I'm still feeling kind of smart. I think it's good. I don't know if it's better than gold. It's harder to store and transport and stuff like that. And so for me to have a significant amount of silver, I'd have to build my garage out of it or something. I don't know, and then paint it. And so, yeah, I like silver, but I've stopped trying to figure out what it's going to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. And then just wrapping up, final question here. Just what is on your radar the most right now, and over the next couple of months, do you anticipate are some of the things that you're going to be looking at the most here?
I'm a big believer in thermodynamics in these markets. So last year, 2018, I gave 20 metrics of valuation. So earlier I invented this concept that's a theft from a savings maxim, which I said overvaluation is appreciation pulled forward and undervaluation is appreciation deferred. And so if you drive markets up to the stratosphere, you're just basically getting appreciation you would have gotten later. And now you have to either burn it down or have it collapse or patiently wait 20 years for the price to catch up to the overvaluation. And so once you've squeezed the last drop out of the lemon, you got to get another lemon somehow. And so I worry about the overvaluations. By 20 metrics last year, I made the case that the markets are round number 2x over historical valuation. So you have to find, to not worry about that, you have to find a model that says yes, but for the rest of eternity, 2x over historical valuation is fine. But that also means that your rate of return is half of what it's going to be. Because if 2x over historical valuation in the past gave you 6%, say, it's not going to give you 3% if you're 2x over that. And then, but I believe it will regress to the mean and through the mean, right? And so I don't know when. My biggest fear is the Fed can stall this for decades and make us suffer for decades. And that's why I'm hateful of them.
That's what everybody seems to think, that they can just keep this going forever.
I don't. I'm only giving that as a theoretical possibility. I believe in House of Cards falling. And what also people don't understand is by these same 20 metrics, if you look at 2009, the markets never got cheap. The markets bounced off of fair value in the depths of 2009. And I've gotten that independently from a bunch of other sources. One day I had a long talk with Mark Spitznagel. He said, yeah, they spent about a month slightly under fair value in 2009. That was it. So people thought that somehow they were deeply, deeply discounted. They were not. And that's how they justify the rally we've just witnessed over the last decade. But the rally we witnessed over the last decade was rallying right into overvaluation again. And so the odds are it'll give it back. What are the problems underlying it all? Well, first and foremost, the next recession. There always will be one, always. And so I think the next recession will not only have problems because they've got so much fuel, sort of Australia level of fuel on the ground. I think it will come associated with it a much bigger social unrest. So in 2000 to 2003, whatever, that recession, we blamed ourselves. We bought stupid stocks. We bought into a model. It wasn't right. You know, a few companies survived well and eventually thrived, but the dot-com era looked like, oh, what was I thinking, right, as Scott McNeely said. 2007 and 9, we blamed the banks, and they promised to get us out of the mess by letting them print money and letting them bail out the banks. I think the next one, we're just going to be mad. When you lose your job again because of the Fed, because of the bank, you're going to be mad. So I worry the next recession is going to have all sorts of anger on the streets level. There's going to be a real an upheaval going on when they try to bail out the banks. And they have to try to bail out the banks. You know that. They can't resist that because that's the house of cards. And right now, estimated, whether it's rated as such is irrelevant. But according to Gundlach, if you look at the actual quality of the corporate debt, they say 39% of corporate debt is junk. 39%. So they say the banking system's safe. And I say, are you sure the banking system's safe if the corporate debt bubble is monstrous and overvalued and underrated or overrated? And that if the corporate debt bubble blows up, are you sure the banks are okay? And then you have 14% of the S&P 500. These are not startups. Excuse me, 14% can't pay the interest rate on their debt with their cash flow. Now, this is interest on debt, in which the interest rates are at millennial lows, and they can't pay the interest on their debt. 14% of the 500 biggest companies, and all of them have underfunded pensions, and so everything looks so wrong to me. Yet you turn on the TV and you turn on your computer, and there the markets just keep going higher and higher and higher. And to the extent that you let the market price tell you how happy to be, you just say, okay, we're just fine. I don't believe it. I think this could change so quickly, so abruptly. And for me, the nice thing about this model is that if when the next recession comes, I get to do the experiment. So if my model's correct, all hell's going to break loose. If the next recession is generic and we have some unemployment, and we have some stuff, and the Fed bails us out, and then we recover, I was just dead wrong. I was N-1 wrong. It's the next one that'll kill us. But the next recession has, in my opinion, has to be a barn burner. It has to be a very mean recession.
And follow-up question, just one last question, because you just put up so much stuff there that was good. Is it happening this year? And do we refer back to what Dudley said when he said, do it so Trump doesn't get reelected? Any thoughts on those two things right there?
Yeah, that Dudley op-ed was rather staggering. That really tells you how deep and dark the system is. I don't know. As I said, I actually think there was a recession in 15 and 16, but they were able to keep it shallow, and they were able to pretend like it never occurred. And so by that model, the next recession wasn't mean, but boy, they did an awful lot of stuff to achieve that goal. I don't know when it's going to happen. To me, it always feels like we're right on the front doorstep. Always, it feels that way to me. So maybe I'm just too much of a perma-doomer. And so I'm now just patiently waiting. And I watch, like, trucking is falling off a cliff, right? How do you have a strong economy with the trucking industry failing, right? There's some guy in Real Vision, what's his name? Keith Giroux, said that, I was wondering where the houses went from the boom in from 2000 to 2007, which, by the way, the bust was visible as far back as late 90s. There were people writing about the dangers of it in the late 90s. Keith Giroux, I was wondering where the house went. I thought private equity bought them all up. So I thought what happened was that super cheap money allowed the PE guys to come in and buy up all the houses. Now they're renting them all. Now, single housing rental is a terrible business unless your carrying costs are zero. And then it's not so bad. So once rates go up, that becomes a lousy model. And maybe that's why the system broke when they tried to hike rates. Who knows? But Giroux says that there are literally millions of houses for which they are not collecting mortgages still, that the regulatory forbearance, the moving the goalposts, is still alive and well. He says there's literally millions of people living in houses without paying the mortgage. All they're doing is paying the taxes, because that's what gets you in trouble. But so who's carrying the worthless debt? I don't know. But that's a big shadow inventory, is what that is.
Dave Collum, I'd like to thank you for joining us today on Silver Doctors.
Thanks for inviting me. Something was happening in the 2016 election that when it went for Trump, I was I realized I was ready for it. And so I wrote about it, and I realized that Hillary made 3 fundamental mistakes that cost her the election. And the 3 mistakes were she rigged the polls and then believed them. And she clearly rigged the polls. The second was when she referred to deplorables. And it wasn't that she called a bunch of people deplorable. They weren't going to vote for her. She used the noun form. And you can watch her try to unwind it, because when she was defending herself, she kept referring to people as being deplorable. And I'm going, no, you said they were deplorables. You dehumanized them. And then when she was arguing against fossil fuels, she said, she didn't say I'm going to put the fossil fuel industry out of business. She said, I'm going to put coal miners out of a job.
Yeah.
And
I remember that one interview when the coal miner confronted her about that. And I think that you're right. I remember that. Remember that when he asked her?
And so Hillary lost the common man with those comments. And not to mention her health, right? And I wrote about that and all sorts of crap. And so I was ready for when Trump won. I realized I had all the ammo to sort it out, right? I had it right in front of me because I've been collecting. And lines, 20 blocks long, trying to get into his campaign stops. I mean,
how's it going out there, Stackers and other smart investors? This is Half Dollar coming at you from Silver Doctors. We are here in Toledo, Ohio, and we are attending Trump's rally tonight. It is Thursday, January the 9th. My daughter is informing me. And right now it is about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We've just got some planes flying around right now saying, "Thank you, President Trump." And trying to get into the Trump rally today. It is Thursday. It is 4:17, although the line is tremendous. I don't think we're going to get in. We'll see what we can do, though, and I'll show you the line here in a minute. What you got for the beanies?
20 cents.
20? No? Okay, $20.
Thank you very much.
All right, appreciate it. You too. Okay, I think is this the end of the line?
Right here, back there.
Oh, we found it! We found it! We found the end of the line. It's 5:56 and we are not able to get in. We could not get in. The doors have closed behind us. I would estimate there are 20,000 people trying to get in. I could not get in.
Yeah. You tell something was happening, right? It was so transformational looking to me, and I thought he was going to lose, but that it was still a pretty important period in history. And then when he won, it's like, holy shit. That, by the way, I think ushered in almost overnight the virulent, hateful liberals. So I think the liberals, who have always been kind of hateful in their own way and snotty and not particularly pleasant people in many ways, but when their favorite candidate of all time lost to their most repugnant opponent of all time, they just lost their shit. And ever since that night, the liberals have been the most meanest douchebags on the planet. And they're not supposed to be, right? They're supposed to, suppose the right wingers are mean bastards and the liberals are compassionate. And the shit they say now is so appalling to me. Yeah. And so to me, the MAGA guys, I don't see Nazis running around the street. I see a bunch of liberal douchebags running around the street.
Yeah.
Right?
And the one thing that's concerning me though is, I know the term is from like I think World War I or World War II, but they talk about the silent majority. And because remember they were saying the silent majority stood with Trump in 2006. My thing right now that I'm seeing is that I just think that everybody thinks that he's such a shoe-in for re-election. What if the silent majority no longer stands with him? Because, like you said,
tell me a demographic who's going to vote against him.
let's say again.
Tell me a demographic who will vote against him, especially if they come up with one of these whack job candidates. Right now, they don't have a good candidate. If Obama ran again, I'd agree with you. They don't have anyone within spitting distance of Obama.
Well, see, I'm not looking at it as a demographic. I'm looking at it as an issue because, for example, the people who voted for him to lock her up and drain the swamp, they're not getting lock her up and they're not getting drain the swamp. Or the people who want to...
They're seeing, though. They're watching him battling bad guys every day. The impeachment hearings and what they see is the Russia collusion, right? So they see a guy who's been brawling with very, very bad people, and he keeps coming out on his feet. I think he is what Taleb would call anti-fragile. He gets stronger every time they fail to defeat him. Mm-hmm. And tell me a demographic who voted for him in 2016 who won't vote for him now.
It's not a demographic. It's a single issue voter that won't.
No. Which single issue voter is going to vote against him?
Well, I told you, the ones who wanted him to lock her up and drain the swamp, the ones who wanted him to bring the troops home and end the wars, the ones who want...
They can see is he tried to get us out of Syria. Right, he really did try. He announced it, and then they faked the goddamn gas attacks, which are now I wrote about that last year, 2 years ago, whatever, about the Syrian gas attacks being a complete fraud. Twitter debunked it in real time.
Right.
And I think the average Joe can see that Trump is fighting the bad people every step of the way, and they understand that he has been handcuffed by these fights. And he's trying to build the wall. They know he's not succeeding at what he said he would do, but they can see why, right? You can see why. I can see why. He's up against this unbelievable machine. These are bad guys. And so I don't think people will vote against him for that. And here's who will vote for him. How many never Trumpers will say, the world's still on its feet. The economy didn't fail. He's showing a tenacity. The Democrats are still as big a douchebags as I always thought they were. I'm voting for him this time, right? Mm-hmm. The never Trumpers have gone away, in my opinion. For all we know, it started already. Economists never see the recession coming. If the trucking is down, turning down and stuff, maybe it started, right? Maybe the contraction's already started.
Did you see that article on Zero Hedge last week that talked about Wells Fargo and a couple other banks have accumulated hundreds of thousands of commodities rail cars?
I did not.
And they're talking about...
What was the premise?
And it was just talking about how they had accumulated hundreds of thousands of commodities rail cars, and that now they're stuck because commodities have been in this bear market and their trade wars.
How do you have a booming economy with commodities in a bear market?
But here's my question. Here's my point, though. But the Zero Hedge article said was talking about the fact that they have accumulated it. But my question is just another little signal. Did they really accumulate them, or were businesses buying those and then they were repossessed because it was securitized debt? So it's kind of like they had no choice in getting them, right. Which would just be another indication of not a good economy, is my point there.
Right. Every indicator I look at says that we're further out on the gangplank than we've ever been. And so every indicator by that model, if I'm not wrong about that, then it says the next recession should be particularly bad.